Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third episode of our three-part series, Okoa Uchumi podcast. We are here with my wonderful speakers. We'll be talking about the IMF Fiscal Consolidation Program in Kenya. And so I'll be your host, Angela Wangeshi. I work with the Institute for Social Accountability. And I'll let my two speakers introduce themselves, starting from my right.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Angela, for having me. My name is Brenda Osoro, and I work with the East African Tax and Governance Network. The East African Tax and Governance Network is a regional membership-based network made up of non-state actors, institutions, and individuals from all over the East African region whose focus is taxation and its intersectionalities and democratic governance. Thank you.
Nice to have you on board, Brenda. On to my left.
Thanks, Angela, for hosting me. My name is Eric Kinaga, and I work with the Institute for Social Accountability, TISA. I work as a programs manager and very glad to be on set here. TISA works to enable citizens claim their voice, find their voice, and claim for their rights, and hold leaders accountable to the promises they make. And effectively, eventually, we hope to make the Constitution of Kenya a lived experience. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. So welcome once more to our podcast. Just to introduce Okoa Uchumi, it is a platform of organizations that have come together, stakeholders, to address the public debt crisis in Kenya. And we do that by pushing for accountability in public debt management. We are available. You can follow us. You can join the movement through www.okoauchumi.com. You can follow us on X at Okoa Uchumi KE, LinkedIn at Okoa Uchumi Kenya, TikTok at Okoa Uchumi, and Facebook at Okoa Uchumi Kenya. Welcome to our podcast. So today, as we all know, we are in a debt situation in Kenya, and I believe IMF has been in the mouth of almost every citizen in this country. But it's good to understand. So what does it mean? IMF, they look like currently they are saving us from our debt crisis that we are in. But what is it about? So we talk about the IMF Fiscal Consolidation Program, and maybe Brenda, you could just help us understand what is it when we talk about IMF Fiscal Consolidation Program. What is it? What are we talking about?
Okay. So the IMF Fiscal Consolidation Program is a set of economic measures and policies that have been prescribed to the government of Kenya by the IMF in order to help us reduce our budget deficit and reduce our debt to levels that are manageable and sustainable. The main objective of the Fiscal Consolidation Program is to stabilize the economy and develop a solid base for which the country can be on a path of economic growth. So the Fiscal Consolidation Program is mainly done in two ways. One, through spending cuts. This could include a reduction in budgetary allocations to certain sectors of the economy, such as healthcare, education, infrastructure. Sometimes it's also privatization of government parastatals, which are considered to be dead weight and not contributing enough to the economy. And sometimes it's the removal of subsidies, such as what we saw last year, the removal of fuel and maize flour subsidies. In a nutshell, that is what the Fiscal Consolidation Program is.
Oh, awesome. So I think we saw, was it last week, that IMF has approved some more, 143.3 billion. And it has been confirmed that it's mobilizing these funds to help us repay. We have a Eurobond that is due, maturing next year in June. And so IMF is on board and here to, help us out of this situation. So being that this is not the first time, so Eric, maybe you could help us because there's been outcry about, the IMF involvement in our country do we have any advantages being in this program?
Thanks. And just to piggyback on what Brenda mentioned, the IMF comes into the country. It's like that. It's that scenario where you have misbehaved. What example can I give? I used to be a truant in school myself. So in class 5, class 6, chasing girls and not doing homework. My mom used to come to school all the time. And then when it was no longer sustainable, my dad had to come to school. And the rest is history. I think it's how I see IMF. When a country is unable to manage its monetary policy, fiscal policies, is unable to put on a leash its appetite for debt and acquisition of debt, and continues over a period of time like we have seen in this country, then the IMF checks in, because it becomes almost like a last resort for a country. When and I really how countries raise debt is borrowing is either domestically and externally, and domestically mainly it's from our banks, and from our banks it's from our deposits when you think about it. And then of course externally is through the commercial bonds, which we popularly call the sovereign bond, the euro bonds. And the longer the appetite sustains, then the higher the interest go up. And that's why you've seen, for instance, in this country, infrastructure bonds are now going for about 17-18%. That wasn't the case some time back. And it's because it's increasingly becoming more risky to lend to government, which ideally has not been the case in previous years. And so over time, there's no longer more legroom for government to borrow. And if it has to borrow, it has to borrow very expensively. And that's when the IMF comes in. So I think the IMF really, in my view, countries and governments that have invited the IMF or got into IMF programs over the course of our history did not do it out of their own will. It was the last resort. They had less bargaining power, and it's the least they could do at that point. And so I think this helps to speak to what are the advantages. When the IMF comes in, it comes with conditions, and we've seen many conditions across the country, whether be it in Malawi, in Zambia, in Senegal, in Cote d'Ivoire, in even here Tanzania, Uganda. We've seen countries get into Tunisia, get into IMF programs, and it comes with conditions. One of the conditions is what Brenda spoke to, is you kick into an austerity or whatever, you to start cutting your spending on public social sectors, education and health. The advantage sometimes, in a sense, especially for a country like ours, is where you have a currency that is overvalued. I think one of the things that I would pick as perhaps a benefit is that when you have a currency that's overvalued, then you have your export as a country not being competitive in the global market. And what that means really is that your balance of payment doesn't look good. And that's been our situation as a country for some time. But in terms of the benefits, is I think it also helps, which is the other bit that we've seen in the conditions of the fiscal consolidation program in Kenya, is the need for government. The government has been forced to think about some of its priority policies. So, for instance, the government, we now have a conversation about privatization, which it's a double-edged sword. For sure, there are state parastatals, there are state-owned enterprises that we have in this country that do not need to exist in the first place. And especially so in a current constitutional order where, under the 2010 constitution, some of the functions that some of these parastatals are holding have already been transferred to counties. So what does it mean to have a mongrel of an institution that has not been reorganized or repurposed to fit into a new constitutional order, which is a devolved system of governance? And there's a lot of, it partly explains why we have a lot of resources for functions that have already been devolved continuing to sit within the national government, and they may not be sitting at the ministry itself, but a lot of these resources are still sitting within the MDAs, the departments, agencies, and the state-owned enterprises. So I think as an advantage, especially with the privatization issue, is to really take a hard look at what are some of the parastatals that we really, really do not need. But like I mentioned, it's a double-edged sword, because as we talk about it, then we are likely to lose parastatals that for sure advance the public good, and the private sector would need to really be accountable to be able to provide the same service. Especially, for instance, a good example is water. And we've seen this trend with the IMF across the African continent and part of South America. We're trying to privatize water. So what does that look like? And we have a bit of that happening in this country. You see, every time if you go out of the street here, it's unlikely that you'll do 500 or 400 meters without meeting a water buzzer. What does that mean for us when you privatize certain services? And I think while looking at the advantages, it feels to me that the disadvantages outweigh the advantages of being in an IMF program. But yes, I think the other bit is the budget cuts, especially like she mentioned. What are some of the budget cuts that would speak to recurrent expenditure that is not really important or a priority? On paper, it looks good, but in practice, budget cuts have meant budget cuts on development expenditure, not on recurrent expenditure. For the time that the country has been in an IMF fiscal consolidation program, we've seen our expenditure rising, our recurrent expenditure rising. We've not seen austerity measures within government that speak to the reality of what the conditions require. In any case, it's been the extreme opposite of that. Thank you.
Interesting. It sounds like they need to be relooked so that we can maybe enjoy the benefits of some of those advantages. But maybe, Brenda, you could also speak to some of the negative impacts, because like Eric has, highlighted, it is the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. Maybe you could just touch into those impacts that are, on our economy, on our citizens' livelihood, that we feel like really these are just not acceptable, and they're as a result of this fiscal consolidation program that we are in.
Well, yes, debt restructuring is a very painful process. And the way that the government has been looking at this is that we have a revenue problem, not an expenditure problem. So they have taken this tax all you can approach. You watch the news or read the newspaper every other week, you see that there's a proposal for some new area to be taxed. And they're passing all these proposals expediently in Parliament without thinking about the impacts that this has on businesses and individual households. So I'm just going to mention some of the impacts that the citizens and businesses have been facing. One is the impact on cost of living. It is very evident that the cost of living has gone up. When you increase taxation on certain basic goods and services, that means the prices of those goods and services will go up, and the income of citizens does not match that. It stays the same. So people who are able to afford certain commodities are now not able to afford them. They have been pushed lower to below the poverty line. And those who are higher up at least are able to afford it. This exacerbates the income inequality that we already have in the country. The second thing is the negative effects that it has on businesses, small, medium enterprises and private sector businesses. It has become very difficult to operate a business. It has become very expensive to operate a business in Kenya because of increased taxation. businesses are struggling to pay their bills because the cost of electricity has gone up, the cost of water has gone up. They are also struggling to keep their employees because they are not able to make enough profits to pay their salaries anymore. So they have to send them home. And sending them home means we have a new pool of people that are unemployed, and it's adding to the unemployment crisis that we already have. We've also seen some businesses closing down because they're not able to sustain their businesses. The cost of doing business is simply too high. And when you kill the private sector, you're basically killing the economy, because the private sector is what contributes to wealth creation and job creation. And therefore, as a consequence, the economy shrinks. There's also some negative impacts on the manufacturing sector. With the finance bill and other subsequent proposals, we've seen the increase in excise duty. The cost of importing raw materials and other factors of production has just become too high. So when companies are manufacturing these products and they put them out in the market, and because the cost of manufacturing these products was too high, the product is going to be very expensive. And so you go to the market and you find that a locally manufactured good is way more expensive than what you would import. Of course, you prefer to import. And this will reduce the demand of locally manufactured goods. And then these people have no reason to stay in business anymore. And just like that, we kill manufacturing. And in relation to that is when we are now in a position where we are importing more goods than we are actually exporting, our balance of payments become distorted. There's no demand for our currency. There's more demand for dollars and euros and wherever we are importing from. There's no demand for our currency, which further devalues it. There is also a sovereign risk that comes with implementing these fiscal consolidation programs, because the structural reforms that we are undertaking, they're not of our own making. They have been imposed on us as a conditionality for getting a loan. They are not responsive to our needs, and they are not responsive to our agenda. This leaves us vulnerable to influence from the powers that be, the Western powers that be. And another negative impact is actually a very defeatist outcome, which means that we are eyeing an increase in the revenue that we are mobilizing, but it could actually result in the opposite, where we're not collecting enough revenue because people cannot afford to buy these goods that we have taxed so highly. So there's no demand, people are not consuming these goods, and therefore we have nothing to tax. I think it was in the news the other day where the Treasury Minister was saying that we are projected to lose about 133 billion Kenyan shillings because people are not buying cars anymore. They're not consuming alcohol anymore. So sometimes it is well-intended, yes, but could result in defeatist outcomes. And then lastly, there's also the issues that it is just a license for wide-scale corruption. So when we are able to access when we are easily able to borrow money, then we have no incentive to try and reform our systems in a way that works for us. We know that anytime we get into a problem, we get into an economic crisis, we can easily run to the IMF and just get more money. Yeah.
And I agree with, I think, everything about that. And I don't know, maybe we got it wrong as Kenyans. Maybe we could, there are lessons we could learn from. I heard you mention we have a few other countries, especially in Africa, that are in this program as well. So is it that we know we got it wrong as Kenyans? are there success stories from some of these countries that maybe we can benchmark and see what we can do better?
It's a good question. Success stories. I mean, maybe I mean, unless we look at success in a different way, how not to do things. I mean, Ghana, for instance, which is a country we've learned from for many years, right from our fight for independence. I mean, they got independence before Kenya. We've learned a lot from Ghana. When the country wanted to float, it's our first Eurobond in 2014. It was Ghana amongst other countries that we were looking at, trying to say this is what they got when they floated. Now the chicken have come home to roost, and what's happening in Ghana can be triangulated with where Kenya is at and what's likely to be the case. But an interesting perspective I learned recently in our engagement about 2-3 months ago with our engagement with actors in Ghana is that Ghana has been on their 17th IMF program.
Wow.
So I think a success story out of that is we know how not to get out of debt.
We can continue. There's room for more.
Exactly. I mean, 17th IMF program. The Tunisian case is not any different. I mean, you've even seen what has happened in Tunisia. A couple of other countries, like I mentioned, in Africa, about close to. Yeah, I mean, I spoke about Ghana, Nigeria. There's Nigeria as well, which has been on an IMF program. There's Cote d'Ivoire, Malawi, Zambia, Uganda, Zimbabwe. I mean, these are countries, when I mention, you already your mind imagines what could an IMF program have done in that country. But just to also give credit to where credit is due, is that an IMF program does not take place in a vacuum. It has many other factors that come into play. But one of the significant things that I fault the IMF for, and because one of the factors that would ensure that a fiscal consolidation program works well, is an accountable governance structure. And that's what we do not have with the IMF. That's what the IMF is not demanding for. So we have autocratic regimes that have gotten us into debt crisis, and that money has been plundered. But the IMF is just interested about raising more revenue, cutting spending, and forgetting, or not rather forgetting, but having a blind eye to other intervening variables that make the problem persist. For Kenya, for instance, and TISA has done this study, I think last year. A study came out around the transparency and accountability issues on Kenya's Eurobonds. At that time, the value had gone to around, I think, 880 billion. Now, because of the exchange rate loss, I think it's edged close more than 1.3 trillion Eurobonds alone. But the unique thing about our Eurobonds is that they've all fell short of the transparency and accountability standard.
True.
Parliament has been bypassed. We've not had due diligence, and there are reports that show convincingly so that we went for Eurobonds in times that we would have gotten cheaper loan. So what does that mean about public interest? And one of the things that the IMF is silent about is the issue about odious debt. The IMF has remained mum. So African countries across board are paying for loans that did not serve their public interest. But the IMF is not joining this. We've not had the IMF speak strongly about that. So are we saying, for instance, that Kenya's the total debt stock of what it is currently, edging to around 11 trillion, is that, first of all, we've not even audited our total debt stock. So Parliament has been recently making that call that we need to audit our debt to be able to tell for sure whether we got value out of the deals that we went to do. One of the most, I think, the poster child of how not to take debt for a country is the SGR, which is now entering the 7th year of declaring losses. and there are many others. We have the expressway, which is about to carry the news in the next coming years, and many other infrastructure projects. And this is just Kenya. If I think if the IMF really meant well for countries, we should expect that the IMF supports efforts, and especially where evidence has been generated that part of our debt stock was not regularly acquired. So what does that mean? And in our chapter on public finance speaks to the merits of what a public debt is. If it falls within that threshold, it's odious debt. And I think that's a conversation that the IMF needs to be part of, because that's part of ensuring that we consolidate our economies and our fiscal issues. I think the other really success from some of these countries is for me is they need to reform IMF, because that has come out significantly. Because when you hear a country like Ghana, Tunisia, and other countries have been through multiple IMF programs, here we are talking about just one IMF program. So if that story holds, then it's possible that we will be in multiple other programs if we don't change our tact. And I think the lesson for me here, and the lesson for us as Africans, Kenyans, is there's no one coming to save us. There's no one coming to save us. We are on our own. And really we are on our own, because really, who is the IMF? The IMF is loosely translated is a circle. It's a company that has shareholding, and how this manifests and has manifested over the years, especially most recently in 2021, is in the allocation of special drawing rights, where about 456 billion SDRs, which are valued at about 650 billion US dollars, were allocated to member countries. And Kenya is a member country, it's a member state of the IMF. But about 84% of the SDRs were allocated to just 20 countries, and the balance shared across the rest of the world. So what does that mean? The IMF does not have our interest. I think that's the basic explanation of what that means. Again, it is visible in, for instance, the voting rights. We have about 46 member states that are part of the IMF in Africa, but all those countries have just 2 executive directors. So even the voting power is skewed. We have no say, less than 10% voting in the IMF board. And so we have 2 options. Of course, one of the options, and they're not alternatives, I think there are things that we must continue to speak about, that the IMF needs to reform, because we are a member state. And even if we have less shares, as you would in a circle, like I do, I've not been the biggest shareholder in the circle I'm part of, but when there's an AGM, I will speak up, because I'm a member of that circle.
They give you an opportunity to.
So I think it's important for African countries to continue to speak up on the need for IMF to reform how it works and how it looks at the continent, because part of for instance, the voting structure within the IMF today was established before independence. So before African countries got independence. So you're talking about a voting structure that has existed earlier than 1950. So what does that mean for some of the issues we are saying that need to be reformed? And that explains why part of our conversations and the advocacy, the demands we've been making to the IMF are not seeing the light of day, because really the IMF does not exist to serve our interest. And that explains why, for instance, even we need to shine more light on some of the conditions, including the privatization, like I mentioned. What does it mean to privatize? Who's going to be the beneficiaries, the ultimate beneficiaries of a privatized sector, for example, energy, water? It won't be us Africans.
Absolutely.
So what does that mean for the global political situation that we find ourselves in? So I think there's a reforming of the IMF, which I think has been a significant lesson as an advantage. But there's also the rejecting of the IMF, because if African states and African citizens can reject the IMF, then it allows us to have more incentive to be able to manage our resources effectively, because then we won't have to invite the IMF, because IMF does not invite itself
It is
into a
us,
country. It's actually
it is
invited.
us who invite them
Precisely.
into
And we invite them because we manage our resources. We mismanage our resources.
Yes.
So I think rejecting the IMF or calling out the IMF is something we need to do, but we must also be more accountable as leaders, as National Treasury. It's curious, for example, to note that there's a study that was done by I think the African Development Bank in 2021 that showed about 32 ministers of treasury or finance. Here we call them National Treasury. Previously we used to call them Minister of Finance.
Yeah.
But about 32 of them in Africa, or is it 37 of them in Africa, actually have links with the IMF, either worked with the IMF previously, including even in our country, both now and previously. And perhaps these are issues that would make it more difficult for us to be able to realize some of the issues we are continuing to push for. But the truth is that when you're able to use evidence and to inform our advocacy and the things we are demanding for, it is important for us to call out the IMF for what it is. It's not a bad thing. It's just that the IMF was not set up for Africa. So I think the lessons is that African states, African leaders need to find a way to organize their affairs in a manner that meets their needs, because IMF programs for sure are not doing service to African countries.
They're not customized for Africa.
Yep.
Interesting. And I think that brings me to, we've seen citizens even, call out IMF, telling them to stop lending Kenya. I don't know if Okoa Uchumi has been engaging IMF. Maybe you could speak to that. Like, what has it been like?
Yeah, so the Okoa Uchumi Campaign has been engaging the IMF since 2019, and we've been engaging, which I think in retrospect, we came a bit late, because part of the lessons I have learned, and I believe the Okoa Uchumi has learned, is you engage the IMF before Article 4 consultations begin, or at the onset of those consultations. So we began engaging after Kenya had signed the fiscal consolidation, the extended credit facility program. And so anytime there's a review, because there's a 6-month review that unlocks a disbursement or informs a disbursement, the IMF comes into town and has those consultations. And so we've been consulting with the IMF, engaging the IMF around what are the issues, because we were able to get hold of the agreement and look at all the conditions. And then the Okoa Uchumi Campaign did an independent assessment of what that monitoring framework looks like, what the conditions look like, and what they could mean for the country. And we were able to provide an assessment of this is good, this is fair, this is really bad for the country. And that's been the form of our engagement with the IMF over the last couple of years. But part of the main asks with the IMF has been, whenever we meet with you guys, you're like, yeah, that's really good. You're demanding for accountability, transparency, that is the issue of social spending is looked into, and they will not say no, but you never have a feedback loop. It never comes back to you. So what Okoa Uchumi largely was doing is raise the issues. Yes, they are welcomed by the IMF, but no concrete action is taken. And part of the main asks from the Okoa Uchumi campaign was a dialogue, not even a dialogue really, but a sitting between the IMF, non-state actors and government, where we are sure that our leaders have had.
Yeah.
Because the unfortunate scenario in this country is that our countries are more accountable to IMF than their own citizens,
Than their citizens.
which is quite unfortunate.
It's unfair.
And so the reason why the Okoa Uchumi was very apt in engaging the IMF is because we discovered government listens to IMF more than it listens to us. And it's so sad that even Parliament is actually not part of those consultations. We've not seen Parliament approve the agreements that come out between the IMF and the National Treasury, and yet in a constitutional framework, Parliament should be able to guarantee our loans and be able to sign on to loans that we take. And this is part of what we hope to be able to see going forward. And so we engaged the IMF until finally we realized it was just a tick in the box exercise. And so in May this year, we did a protest letter exempting ourselves from Article 4 consultation engagements. And then thereafter, even with the change of guard with the IMF country representative, recently, I believe in October, the Okoa Uchumi Campaign rescinded its participation and engagement to the IMF on that. Not because we do not think it's important, but because we do not feel that it is adding value to us, for us to continue speaking about the same things over and over again and no action being taken. And I believe the members and the partners within Okoa Uchumi continuing to actively pursue alternative advocacy measures to ensure that the issues we've continued to raise over the years are effectively addressed.
It's interesting. And maybe, Brenda, you could speak to some of this. Like, we are in this fiscal consolidation program, Okoa Uchumi is engaging. So what are some of the recommendations that the campaign is giving, even as we continue? Because we are it is underway, we cannot drop off midway. So what are some of the recommendations of the Okoa Uchumi campaign that would probably see us, handle this situation even better than we are doing?
Well, I think one of the most important things we need to realize is our solutions are not out there. They are not out there with the IMF. They are not out there with external funders. We need to look inwards. We need to develop our homegrown solutions, and we have the capacity to do that. I think Eric has laid out that historical relationship with the IMF in a bit. We have been engaging with the IMF since the late 1970s. This is not the first fiscal consolidation program or structural adjustment program that we are undertaking, and we're certainly not the first country to do so. But what have been the results? Where have these reforms that have been promised, where are they? The prosperity that they're always promising, they tell us, if you undertake these reforms, if you structure your fiscal systems this way, then you're going to experience growth, then you're going to be in a better place. But we have not seen that so far. So we really need to reassess the relationship that we have with the IMF and try to develop our own solutions. And there's a number of ways that we can do that. I think first and foremost, we need to apply the principles of human rights when we're making these decisions. That is participation. Eric just mentioned that Okoa Uchumi has been putting in the time and trying to engage the IMF, trying to engage with the government of Kenya, the Ministry of Finance, and then they just go ahead and do whatever they want. The government needs to be accountable to us. There needs to be non-discrimination. People need to be empowered, and it needs to be legitimate. Citizens need to be educated alongside with some capacity building on what their revenue responsibilities are. And once they have paid tax, what duty does the government owe them? I think when each party understands what their obligation towards each other is, then it is easier to have a conversation about accountability. Another thing that we can do is that before we even look to go borrowing, we should focus on domestic resource mobilization in our country. We do not have a revenue problem. I don't think the problem is that we are not raising enough money. We're not mobilizing enough revenue. The problem is that we are engaging in a lot of wasteful spending. We can look at revenue leakages. There's an Okoa Uchumi report from 2021 that estimates that we lose almost 400 billion Kenyan shillings annually to tax expenditures. Tax expenditures is that revenue that is foregone when we decide to give tax incentives and tax exemptions to multinationals and other groups and individuals. Imagine what 400 billion Kenyan shillings can do, the number of schools it can build, the number of hospitals it can build, the infrastructure that it can support. It is critical to look at our tax expenditures and see whether they are justified, because a lot of research has shown that it is actually not key to attracting foreign direct investment. That is how the government justifies it. Other factors are more important, like stable macroeconomic factors, good infrastructure, and a predictable trade environment. Those are more important. Those are more important in attracting foreign direct investment. Second is the way that we spend our money is just so wasteful. It is very difficult to convince a citizen to pay more tax when you're out on foreign trips with almost 100 delegates every other week, when there's members of parliament walking around with wads of cash in bags, when there's other cabinet secretaries wearing watches and shoes worth $1,000. It affects their willingness to pay tax. You cannot convince them to pay more tax because they do not see it translated in public service delivery. We also need to find a way to curb corruption. I believe it was in a documentary by John Allan Namu, where the Auditor General from, I think this President Uhuru's first term, mentioned that half of the money that we received from the Eurobond cannot be accounted for. And there is no way, the paper trail is lost. There is no way of finding the individuals that are responsible for the mismanagement or the loss of these funds and holding them accountable. We really need to hold individuals that are implicated in corruption scandals accountable and prosecute them as an example to others. Another thing we can do is that before we are ready to before we are ready to commit to loans, we need to be ready to implement those projects. We are paying a lot of money in commitment fees. I think the figure stood at around 300 billion late last year. And commitment fees is money that the lender charges the borrower when they have committed and set aside these funds to loan to you, but you have not yet utilized them, and they have to charge you because they are not receiving interest on this payment. That is a lot of money to be lost. And if we really have to borrow loans, then we have to look to traditional concessional loans, not private sector commercial debt, which lately the government is leaning more towards. The problem with private sector debt is that it is very, very expensive, has short maturity dates, meaning that the period between the time that you get it and then invest it, you will not have been able to realize the benefits of the investment of that loan in order for it to be able to repay itself. Commercial loans also have very high interest rates and are vulnerable to market changes and variations in currency. So we really need to look at that. We really need to go back to negotiating for concessional loans. Another recommendation that the Okoa Uchumi Coalition makes is that borrowing only be spent on development projects. This is actually anchored in the Public Finance Management Act. It says that all funds that are borrowed should be put into a consolidated fund, and then that money will only be used for development. I think the government has been in breach of this so many times, where borrowed funds are used to pay off existing loans, and it is also used to fund recurrent expenditure. This does not guarantee that you'll be able to realize benefit from that loan to be able to repay itself. So we need to look at that. And so I'd just like to finish by saying that there's someone that said that the development of the West is dependent on the underdevelopment of the South. So we cannot expect in good faith for them to want you to prosper, because their wealth creation, their prosperity is actually dependent on you maintaining a certain level of poverty. So we need to reassess the relationship that we have with the IMF, and we have the solutions, we have the capacity. We just need to hold people accountable.
Wow, very interesting closing remarks from Brenda here. It is worth noting that even as we continue to engage. And maybe Eric, as you close, what's the way forward with Okoa Uchumi engagement with IMF? And you can speak to that as we give our closing remarks.
All right. Thanks. I think the way forward for the Okoa Uchumi engagement to the IMF, really, and Brenda has spoken about part of it is really the IMF is still in our radar. The IMF is still in our radar. Like I mentioned, the study that was done a while back sought to look at the comparisons between the current fiscal consolidation program that we have and the structural adjustment programs of the 70s and the 80s. And what came out was that they are not different, really. And the more things have changed over time, the more they have remained the same. So that is a call for us to keep at it, keep the focus on IMF, because as we have more aggregated voices across the continent demanding that the IMF reforms how it looks and treats its other states in the global south, then we're going to be able to move the needle over time. And part of the demand, I think, really, Brenda spoke about progressive tax reforms. Revenues are important. She mentioned about domestic resource mobilization. It's important for us to be able to meet our budget. We need to raise the tax revenue to GDP, which is significantly low for the country at the moment. I think about 15% or less. And get it to a level where we are able to sustain and meet our needs. But part of the reason why, and this is my very lazy pedestrian theory, is part of the reason why our economy hasn't collapsed really is because it's very informal. I think there are a lot of Kenyans who are not paying tax. That's a reality. If you look at the cars we see on the road, the apartments coming up, and the revenue we are collecting, and the number of Kenyans who are gainfully employed, who are about just 3 million, between 900,000 and 1 million in public service, and about 2 million in private sector, for a country of 50 million Kenyans, and everything we are seeing around. The truth is that not all of us are carrying their weight. And I hope to be able to see reforms that ensure that we're able to nab as many as possible, but also to ensure that we're able to deepen the tax base, really. There are promises we had from this government around wealth tax that haven't moved beyond a proclamation and a commitment.
True.
Brenda spoke about tax expenditures. A National Treasury report came out in October that showed that last year our tax expenditures were about 393 billion, which I believe is conservative. But really, those are the official figures that we have. But the amount that this controversial housing levy is seeking to collect every year is just 73 billion. And you have rugged Kenyans left, right, and center just to collect 73 billion. And we are losing close to 400 billion per year on tax expenditures.
Yes.
And those are not tax expenditures to me and you.
No.
It is not to ordinary Kenyans.
Absolutely
The question
not.
is, can we unpack that and see who are these beneficiaries? Because really there are people in our midst who are sitting on our backs as we toil and labor every day. So I think it's to look at the issues of tax expenditure, reform the accountability, because for a long time we've believed that the problem has been our expenditure. I think there's been a lot of focus even among civil society actors on expenditure work, but not very much focus on revenue. And I think that's where the devil is in those details. So I think more focus on revenue, accountability, even with the counties. A report by the Commission on Revenue Allocation last year or early this year, I believe, showed that counties are collecting just about 30% of their true capacity or potential. And it's not a coincidence that the counties that have the highest on-source revenue also happen to have no automated revenue collection systems. It cannot be a coincidence.
It's not.
So what does that mean about revenue that is seeping away that would otherwise come and do our public good and help to reduce our deficit? But I think the other bit, especially in terms of the way forward, is we need austerity, yes, but austerity that is aligned to our realities. And the realities of this country is that, yes, we are good looking, we are good people, we have a progressive constitution, but we are one of the most unequal countries on earth.
Yes, yeah.
At independence, the promise was to deal with poverty, ignorance, and disease. 60 years down the line, poverty, ignorance, disease, and inequality still are the challenges that we face. So what does it mean for Kenyans who may no longer access education just by virtue of their social status going forward because of a condition of reduced spending to universities? Are we saying that education might likely, for example, be a preserve of the rich? Are we saying that the women, the data, for every 40 women who deliver in this country, one of them dies, and they die from preventable causes? So are we saying that it's okay for 1 out of 40 to continue to die as we sort out our issues? Or 1 in 19 kids born in this country who don't meet their 5th birthday? Are we saying that it's okay for us to deal with those realities? As they can continue to die as we continue to sort out our issue, put our house in order. I think it's important for us to push back about the fact that we have high poverty levels. We have close to I think 20 million plus now Kenyans sinking below the poverty line, living below the poverty line. What does that mean? So even in a fiscal consolidation program, the question is, what happens to those 19 million who are part of this country and need to be taken care of, whether we're in an IMF program or not? And that's part of our reality. I think lastly is the issue of accountability. Management of our public finance resources needs to continue. I think it's very sad, for example, when we see attacks on the control of budget, which in my view are, as we saw recently, cannot be again a coincidence. So we need to be able to see a greater level of accountability of resources, and an attendant political culture that is alive to the progressive nature of our constitution. Because I think we have a progressive constitution, but a political culture that reeks of impunity. So I think a greater level of accountability will help us to ensure that we can build back a better country than we currently are in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think we'll wrap it up at that. And we just welcome all the stakeholders to come on board, join the movement as we push our government to be accountable in managing our public debt, in managing our public finance resources. Thank you very much, our listeners. I hope we get to learn. I hope we get to engage, and we continue with this conversation.